Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Talk to Doctor. My name's Eddie, the angry Santa of fandom, and today I'm with Tom Spilsbury, formerly the editor of Doctor Who magazine, and we're here today to kind of put to bed the argument that happens on line all the time about whether Doctor Who during the Chibnall era has regressed in viewing figures, AI, that kind of thing, you know, and whether that's down to the fact that the era wasn't very good or isn't very well received, or whether it's just a change in how television is kind of viewed by the general public. Tom, welcome to Talk to the Doctor. It's been a long time in the planning this, but maybe it's good that the series is virtually over, that we can look back and kind of look at it as a whole now. So that's quite a good timing, I think, probably.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We've got a couple of specials this year, and then it's not quite clear how things are going to go beyond that, but Doctor Who carries on, it seems. I don't know if anyone really thinks you know, when things are, you know, it's always going to be cancelled as this. I mean, look, Doctor Who has clearly endured for so long. I think even cancellation wouldn't hold it back in the long run anyway. But
it didn't the last time, so
exactly. I mean, I've been rather upset today by the idea that Neighbours might be coming to an end, and it's you know, and I think because with something like that, you know, there's the fear that if that does end, that probably will end forever. And you know, I don't think anyone really thinks that would be the case with Doctor Who, do they? I mean, I think it's proved beyond all doubt now that I mean, we can get on to talking about specifics and ratings and all of that in a minute, but I think clearly it's shown beyond all doubt that the Doctor Who is bigger than any individual era or any individual doctor or any individual showrunner. It's got something about it which is going to endure probably long after we're all gone. So, you know.
Absolutely. And someone said today, I know that Matt Stevens has been in Radio Times talking about that, you know, the Whittaker era, and I think he kind of admitted to himself, or admitted to everyone, that he realizes that it hasn't been universally loved. But he says it will have its fans and people will look back on it, you know, more fondly. And I think that's probably true, because look at, I know Colin Baker had the same issue. I think Sylves did as well, you know, but now they're adored mostly.
People are never going to be as fierce in their criticism as they are when it's the current thing. I think that's probably true, isn't it? I mean, if we put on a DVD of The Dominators now, people might love it. Other people might think it's awful. I mean, I think probably it's not controversial to say it's not one of the better Patrick Troughton stories. But does anyone get angry about The Dominators? Does anyone get really cross that they made it? Probably not, because I mean, for a lot of us, it was on before we were born. You know, we know what it is. We know it didn't kill the show. We know that there was a life beyond that. And so I think actually it sort of stops mattering whether that particular one was any good or not in a way. You know, we can have a discussion, but it all becomes a little bit abstract in a sense. I mean, I remember, you're right. I mean, you know, sort of the Colin Baker years, the Sylvester McCoy years, you know, fandom was quite vocal about those. I think you can go back earlier. I think it's sort of the later Tom Baker years, some of the Graham Williams era stuff. I think because always there's that kind of is it a fear or you know, the idea that could kill it, that might be the last note that we end on, and somehow that would be the sort of the you know, the taste that we're left with will be the Horns of Nimon or whatever, you know, and you know, once it's changed, it might change in our individual opinion for the better, or it might change in our individual opinion for the worse. But actually what was past no longer sort of matters, because it's already changed into something else. So if you don't like the Stephen Moffat, Peter Capaldi years, which some people weren't so keen on, it doesn't really matter now, because it's already changed into something else. And that will happen to the Jodie Whittaker, Chris Chibnall era, won't it? You know, people might prefer what comes next, or they might not, but whatever happens, that era will be gone. So it kind of, it can sit on our shelves. So
I think for me, and I think for a lot of people, and you know, I know we follow each other on Twitter, so you'll see a lot of the stuff that comes through my feed and vice versa. And I think for me, one of the issues has been with particularly the Chibnall era, isn't so much the ratings change, because the ratings is a big stick that everyone uses to bang everyone else over the head with. But I think it's been the Timeless Children Act and the significant change to canon. I think that has...
Of course, and I think, there will always be the thing that people are motivated about in whatever way, put it that, the thing that's got people agitated, or perhaps, it's certainly going to be a controversial thing, something like that, isn't it? We've seen on some level, we've seen these kind of things in the past. I remember people talking about Clara helping the First Doctor on Gallifrey, and people didn't like that necessarily. Is it because we quite like to sort of feel that the past that we've seen or know is somehow fixed and shouldn't be meddled with in a way? I think we can be quite conservative as fans like that. I mean, I've got my own personal thoughts on this, but you're right that people do react far more strongly about these kind of things, which somehow seem to affect the history, the canon, if you like, the continuity, all of these kind of things. And I do find it interesting, and I'm sure it's the case with other big franchises. Well, I'm not particularly a Star Wars fan, but do people get upset about the sort of if there's ever sort of meddling with the continuity? Or
yes,
I'm sure they do. So I mean, I asked that in pretty much in ignorance, but and I think Star Trek and these, and not just sci-fi stuff, the soaps have things. If they get things wrong, we get cross about it, or wrong in inverted commas. If it doesn't fit with what we think it should be. And I think when people then talk about ratings and things like that, it's often to a certain extent, you can sort of see people trying to justify the opinion they already have about the series. I think we can all be a bit guilty of that. If we don't like something, we are probably more likely to sort of want to say, point our finger and say, and look, all these people agree with me. But on the other side, people do that as well. Yeah. So I try to look at the facts of it and try not to let a personal opinion on what I think about anything get in the way. Mm-hmm. There are lots of things which are very popular that I don't particularly like, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But the facts are facts. And the bottom line, we can talk in a bit more detail about a lot of this in a minute, but the bottom line is Doctor Who's still doing fairly well. It's not at its peak of popularity. It's certainly not at the absolute sort of nadir of popularity. There have been times when it's been performing much worse than it is right now. But could it be doing better? Yes, I think it could be doing a bit better. But it always just, I find it slightly amusing that people sort of squabble about this quite so much, because actually in the end, they only really matter to us as the audience insofar as will they carry on making the show or not. I mean, yeah, we like supporting a football team. Yeah, we like to see it do well, but where it differs from supporting a football team is actually, we don't watch it just to see it do well. We watch it because we want to enjoy it, don't we? I mean, if the stories that we enjoy aren't necessarily the ones that were watched by the most people. So, whereas, I think with a football team, probably the matches we enjoy the most are the ones where our team actually did do well as well, and they did win. So it's interesting, this relationship we have with it. I also suspect, just following on from that part of this comes from because Doctor Who was cancelled back at the end of the 1980s, and a big part of that decision was because not enough people were watching it anymore. That's something which we all remember, or even if we weren't around in those days, younger fans, they know that was the case. And it sort of lingers as a kind of race memory, a kind of injury, that a sort of shared hurt that happened. And it could happen again. Shows do get cancelled because not enough people are watching them. but at the moment, we're probably about as far away from that happening because we already know that it's going to carry on for at least another 2-3 years. I mean, it's not quite clear, but they've said that Russell is going to do, series beyond the 60th anniversary, haven't they? So, in a sense, this is probably the point where we just don't need to worry in that sense, whether you like Doctor Who in its current form, whether you're worried about Russell or excited about Russell. In a sense, all of that's off the table because we know it's going to happen for a bit longer, and then we'll see.
Do you think Russell's coming back to save the show, or do you think he's just coming back because he loves it?
Well, I think he's certainly coming back because he loves it. I don't think there's a question about that. I mean, in terms of saving it, well, again, that's a slightly loaded way of putting it. I know that Russell would hate to see the series wither away, and with Chris leaving the series, there is that question mark over, well, what do they do next? There've been lots of theories about, well, who could take over, but it's interesting. It's in terms of the sort of the people who could do it and would want to do it, it's actually not a huge long list. So you'd have to ask Russell about what his personal reasons are for wanting to do it. But they will certainly have an ambition to want to raise the profile of the series. Obviously, it's heading towards a big anniversary. Those are always a bit double-edged because you're celebrating something being very old when you do an anniversary, aren't you? You're sort of reminding people it's been around for ages, and then you have to do the episode after the anniversary, and I went and it's still here. Here's another one. So that's tricky, but I think it's in as good a hands as it could be, really.
Have you heard the David Tennant rumours about David being the one?
I've heard those rumours. Yeah. I mean, there's always rumours around about what's going to happen, and it's always interesting to see which ones come true and which ones don't. We sort of forget. I think people are very dismissive of rumours, and then some of them do come true, but people sort of forget the ones that because they, the ones that are printed in the Sun or the Mirror, and sometimes they get things right, or it's got semblance of truth. So who knows? But I think it'll be interesting to see what they do anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my point of view, I have this rumor ages ago, and someone actually said to me, Jodie will regenerate, but not into who you think she'll regenerate into.
Right.
And I went, right, well, that's intriguing. And I've done a bit of digging, and you know what I'm like, I kind of persevered. And someone went, it's Tennant, and I said, shut the front door or words to those effect. And I said, well, how's that going to work? And they said he's the Watcher. So he comes back and he basically is a transitional doctor between Jodie and whoever takes over, And I like the idea. It's an interesting concept.
Well, obviously we'll see. I do think it's interesting how people are all very sure about what Russell will or won't do.
Yes, absolutely.
That's the thing that makes me laugh. Russell wouldn't do that. Definitely wouldn't do that, or he would do. He definitely will do that. And I think actually the only thing you know is that Russell will do what Russell will want to do, and it won't be. I chuckle to myself a little bit seeing comments along those lines because I think you don't really know what Russell's like at all. Yeah. He will do what he thinks is the best thing to do for the story.
And normally at the very last minute as well. Knowing Russell.
Well, yeah, but yes, I mean, obviously they haven't started filming yet, as far as I'm aware. So I mean, I guess, and look, we're talking about the 60th anniversage. That's still a little way away, isn't it? So.
Nearly 2 years, or a year away from that. 2 years away. It is 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know quite how they, how it's all going to. Form on screen. It's going to be a funny one anyway. Again, I know we're sort of getting off the topic, but we're in full flow now. But obviously we've got this anniversary of Doctor Who, but it will sort of come off the back of this anniversary of the BBC. So we've kind of got, again, you're reminding people of these things that have been around for a long time. I don't know how. I guess Chris and Russell will have different approaches to celebrating an anniversary in the way that you do that, because they're different sorts of anniversary in a way, but that's a strange thing, because the problem in a sense you have with anniversaries is you can't move where they fall. They are where they come. So Doctor Who will turn 60 in November 2023. regardless of anything else, you know, that's going to happen. So so you either make a thing of it and celebrate it, or you don't. But it's not movable.
That's right. And the BBC, obviously, the centenary, that's in November as well. That's, I think,
yeah,
that's
is it November or
13th.
October? I think.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I guess they'll have various programming which will be on, because it's not like they're going to put everything on one night, like I presume. But you know, they'll have to have various plans. I mean, we obviously know about Doctor Who, but I guess they'll have special episodes of other.
You would think so.
Shows. I work for a TV magazine.
I heard tales of David Jason wanting to do something with Del Boy. You know,
yeah, wouldn't that be lovely? Wouldn't that be lovely? I mean, again, it's a sort of we do love the nostalgia for these things, don't we? And of course, also sometimes you're sort of reminding of the fact it's hard to catch lightning in a bottle again. You know, I mean, obviously John Sullivan's no longer around to write Only Fools and Horses, so in a sense, you're already missing a very important element of that show. But we'd like to see David Jason back as Del Boy, I think.
Always, it was on something. What was it? I saw him on something. I think it was he was talking to Paul Whitehouse, who plays Grandad in it on the stage. And he done a wee kind of thing, I think it was in This Morning or something. And he went from David Jason to Del Boy. And it was so nice to just see Del Boy again, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, I guess I don't quite know what's going to happen, but I'm sure the anniversary will have elements of things that are there to remind us of the old days and whatever form that takes. But yeah, I mean, getting back to what we were saying anyway about this current era. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that there has been a decline in viewership. Well, there's clearly been a decline in viewership. Then the follow-up question is how much of a decline is it, and why has that happened, and is it sort of in line with other shows? Because you know, if everything is going, and the answer is complex, not one particular thing. There are lots of different things going on. So you know, one thing that I think is important to remember is that the Jodie Whittaker era, the first episode, I think, started with the highest figure of any new Doctor at all. I mean, I remember being very surprised that it went quite so high, because, you know, it was higher than Matt Smith's first episode, or Peter Capaldi, David, all of them, you know, and even Christopher Eccleston's, I think. So it started from a higher level, which of course does put you on a sort of hiding to nothing as to where you go from there.
It's immediately Damocles sword, isn't it? It's immediately.
Yeah, it's tricky, and I think you know that has to be acknowledged as a thing. And it did actually stay fairly high for a good few weeks, but the problem was it did sort of go down fairly sort of, you know, step by step, and whereas other seasons of the show, which had sort of maybe not started as high, tended to sort of go up and down a little bit, whereas this was more of a steady decline down, but it had started higher, so in a sense it would be trickier for it to go, you know. So there's that. You can look at the average figure for her first series, and it's clearly a very impressive average, that first season. The second series falls off a fair bit more, and so we're sort of around a level which looks sort of comparable to the final Peter Capaldi series, you know, which is where it had been immediately before we got that boost with the new Doctor. So you could argue that you know, you get a lot of people who are interested for a short while because of the publicity around a new Doctor, and then slowly but surely you sort of end up, you know, whittling down to sort of the people who were there before. I think that, broadly speaking, that's what's happened. But on top of that, you've also got this trend where there is a decline generally for a lot of shows. You know, I tried to, in my columns in Doctor Who magazine, I tried to sort of point out what some other shows. Obviously, not literally everything. There are always outliers, things that go the opposite way. Doctor Who itself was one of those for Jodie's first season, but you know, that's why it seems so impressive, because everything else was dropping down, and suddenly you got a big increase for that particular series. But you know, at times the drop has been a little bit more than everything else. At times the drop has been a little bit milder than everything else. We can look at things like the chart positions in the TV ratings chart, and that gives us a better idea about how it's performing versus everything else. I mean, I pointed out, it's quite funny, that the latest season, the Flux season, had an average chart position of 17th place, which is the same as Christopher Eccleston's series. So it's not being watched by as many people, but then everything has gone down a certain amount. So it's, on average, was sort of looking roughly about the same position in the TV chart. I thought that was interesting. And it's actually up in chart position a little bit from her second year. The second year has seen some of the lowest chart positions. I think I'd have to check exactly which episodes, but Can You Hear Me, maybe, and possibly Ascension of the Side. It was some towards the end of that season were dropping out of the top 30. So there was an argument to say at that point, not only were they some of the lower figures that it had, but they were also proportionately lower because they were dropping out of the TV top 30. Not by much. I think the lowest it went was 35th, which is not an appalling position. I mean, I see sometimes YouTubers come out and they sort of say what an appalling result. It's not an appalling result. It's perhaps a bit disappointing. But there are plenty more shows than the 34 above Doctor Who that are on every week. Should it be doing a little bit better? Probably a little bit. I think there have been times where it could be doing a bit better than it has been. I was quite surprised to see that the latest special, which was on New Year's Day, is now was lower than all of the Flux episodes. I thought it might do a bit better because generally the one-off specials have had a bit of a boost for those one-off events. Partly because they're bank holidays. You tend to get families together a bit more. The Christmas episodes usually used to do a bit better than the normal episodes. But that didn't really happen this time. So that was perhaps a little bit disappointing. And it was, I think, about 26th for the week, whereas usually those specials have been up towards the top 10. So yes, definitely lower, definitely a bit disappointing by its own standards. By the standards of BBC One, they'll think that's okay. They'll probably be a little bit disappointed, to be fair. They probably hoped it would do a bit better. You always hope it's going to do better. But the key thing is to sort of say that doesn't mean it's also a disaster and cancellation territory, because it's clearly not cancellation, because they've just announced they're not cancelling it. They're carrying it on for some little while yet with Russell T Davies. So that in itself shows. But yeah, so we'll see where it goes from here. You mentioned things like AI figures, and I don't know if all the people listening in will necessarily know what those are, but they basically are a score out of 100, which a representative sample of it's not literally every viewer, because I don't do it. I don't know if you ever done.
No.
Yeah, fill one of these things in. But yeah, they ask you to score the television that you watch each week with marks out of 10, a bit like when people go on Gallifrey Base and give it a score out of 10, I suppose. But you do it for all the shows that you watch each week. And they're a bit more complex than that. I think they have various other questions they ask you about whether you found educational, what was the standard of writing, what was the acting like, did you like the characters, all those kind of things. But for the AI figure itself, it's an average multiplied up, so it's out of 100. But you'll tend to find recent Doctor Who figures have been sort of roughly between 75 and 79, I think. Have been sort of ranges.
All of Flux was below 80. And that's the first. I mean, in comparison, the 15 years before it, since Chris Eccleston, I think there's only 3 below 80. So,
yeah, I mean, and of course, on the face of it, that doesn't sound particularly low. In a score out of 100, but it is quite low for drama. Most drama tends to score above 80, and so below that number is for drama considered to be on the low side, even though, as I say, that shows people might be giving it 7s and 8s out of 10, which it doesn't feel intuitively, that doesn't sound too low, does it? But it's on the lower side of what shows tend to get, and partly that's because unlike on Gallifrey Base, where we sometimes go on and think, I didn't like that episode, I'll give it 1 out of 10. On the whole, viewers watching the TV that they watch, they tend to really only watch shows that they like on the whole. So if they watch every episode of Not Going Out, or Emmerdale, or whatever else it might be, generally they'll probably give it the same score every week because it's one of their shows that they like. And if it was a show they really didn't like, they would stop watching it. So that's why the figures tend to be higher, because you're not getting, on the whole, lots of people giving it 1 out of 10 every week, because why would you watch a show that you give 1 out of 10 to, you wouldn't.
Yep.
So that's just a bit of background about how that works. So yeah, I mean, it's lower than some of the numbers it was getting a few years ago. There has been a bit of a decline there.
Is that down to how people watch telly though, or is that actually specifically down to the fact that it's that Doctor Who's got worse, or people have stopped watching it?
I mean, in terms of whether it's got worse, that's always going to be a subjective opinion. Yeah, I mean, it shows people aren't giving it as high scores as they were before. Why that is, obviously, for any individual, that will be a number of different reasons. Collectively, you can say, well, it shows that people aren't enjoying it quite as much as they were before. I don't think we can get too strong, much stronger than that, because obviously maybe part of the reason then it drops because some people then who aren't enjoying it as much also then stop watching, so they're no longer part of that survey. And as I say, it's only a representative survey anyway, but not literally everyone is contributing, but it should be representative across the different types of demographics and all of that. It's it's not I mean, it always used to be said, I think Stephen Moffat used to say this to me, and he's got a point, that the shows that nobody watches, your BBC4 shows that get 10,000 viewers, really tiny audiences, will tend to get really high AI figures, because the people who really want to watch that specialist program about Spanish pottery, they're all going to give it 10 out of 10 because they've really sorted it out. So of course you tend to get a very high AI figure with very low audiences. Similarly, shows which have really big audiences will find it hard to get really high AI figures because there's just so many people watching. And again, that intuitively makes sense, doesn't it? That you kind of get that. So you tend to find that soap operas like EastEnders will tend to be in the 70s because, I think Doctor Who's kind of got into that category now where there are a lot of people who we're not going to stop watching, but maybe we're not enjoying it quite as much as we were a few years ago. So we're marking it a little bit lower than we were overall. It doesn't have the sort of novelty that it once did. Whether it's not for me or any individual to say, it's objectively got worse. We might have an opinion on that, but collectively, that will be the
For me, I was quite surprised at some of the AI during Flux, particularly because I thought War of the Sontarans was one of the best episodes in years, and also Village of the Angels as well. Cracking episodes.
Well, I think the other thing to remember about those AI figures is that when, as I say, I made the comparison to going and voting on Gallifrey Base or any other forum you might be a member of and giving a score out of 10, and we see that. But then when we're doing that, we're generally sort of comparing it to last week's episode or the week before. So I didn't like episode 3 very much, but episode 4, that was really great. So episode 3, I'm only going to give a 4 out of 10, but the Angel episode, I'm going to give that a 9 out of 10. On the whole, AI figures don't tend to fluctuate as much as that because people aren't really comparing it to the previous episode so much as they're kind of more comparing one TV show with another TV show. So generally speaking, people will give Doctor Who 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 or whatever it is nearly every week because they're comparing it to the other shows they watch every week. It's more a sort of mark on where they sort of feel the show is at any given point rather than necessarily the specifics of that one episode. Obviously that comes into it. You can see where there has been a noticeable dip down, but those dips down do tend to be like by 1 or 2 points, whereas the difference in figures on a fan forum will be much bigger than that. You'll see episodes which are averaging 91 if it was an AI figure, and some, I think, I can't remember one of the episodes this series, in terms of the fan forum, I think this is a Gallifrey Base forum. I know there are other forums out there which will also have polls, but I think there was one episode might have been the Vanquish. I think it might have been the finale. Would have been about a 47. You know, which is obviously way lower than any AI figure.
Yeah.
But then similarly, you know, a 91 is higher than most AI. You know, we tend to get that. You see what I mean? You know, the fluctuations a lot more. So yeah, I think what the AI figures tell us is not so much about what did the viewers think of that specific episode in isolation. It tells us a bit more about what do they make of Doctor Who in the current sort of era and form that it has. You know, so yeah, it may well be that if it's stuck in that sort of 75 to 79, you know, kind of range, that will be about as high as it goes at the moment, you know, and maybe 75, 74 even might be about as low as it goes. But, you know, whereas Once Upon a Time, I think probably in the David Tennant times, I think they did get a 91 at one point, and I think an 85 would have been quite low, and 84 would have been lowish comparatively.
I think Capaldi went from about 82 to 87, kind of give or take. You know, the odd one higher, the odd one
Remember,
lower.
Heaven Sent was 80, and that was low. And I think sometimes you look at there are sometimes episodes which are a bit unusual, you know, outside the norm, and I think it's fair to say Heaven Sent is definitely one of those.
Yeah. It's
not the sort of episodes that we would describe as a typical Doctor Who episode, and I think when you get those, they do tend to, whatever fans think of them, usually they'll get lower AI figures because it's just not what people are expecting. Thinking, what's this? Is this Doctor Who? Love and Monsters famously got a much lower AI than normal, and I think whatever you might think of it as a fan, I know some people love it, some people hate it appropriately, but I think as much as anything that got a low AI figure because Doctor Who wasn't really in it that week much. You know, it was that wasn't what people tuned in for. They did it rather more successfully with Blink, I think, you know, a year later. That even though I'm very fond of Love and Monsters, but Blink, I think, was such a clever way of, if you're going to have an episode which doesn't have the Doctor in it, and therefore people might think, "Where's Doctor Who this week? I wanted to watch Doctor Who. He wasn't in it." You know, I think that episode was a bit smarter with how they they sold that, and that didn't get a noticeably low AI. I can't remember what it did get. We can look it up, but I think it was in line with other episodes of that period.
Do you think the change in day has had anything to do, or I mean, we spoke
maybe
to
a little bit. I mean,
because Capaldi, Capaldi, obviously, you know, a lot of people are comparing season 10 to season 11 and season 12, but different days, different audiences. Maybe so much different audiences.
It will have a mild impact. I wouldn't say very much, actually, a little bit. I mean, we tend to get the AI figures, you know, fairly quickly. So it will be people who've watched it fairly quickly, because obviously as we know from the way the ratings work, there are some people that don't watch it for a week or maybe longer. So obviously by that point the AI figure's already released. So it's not like, you know, we don't. Is there a reason to think that people who watch it earlier might score it differently to people who watch it later? Maybe, because it might be, and this is just I'm just throwing this out, I'm not saying this is definitely the case, but you might find that on a Sunday night, you've got a higher proportion of people who were just in watching telly, whatever's on, than you did on a Saturday. We know that the overnight figures on a Sunday tended to be a bit stronger than they were on a Saturday. We've seen that. But we've also seen with the Jodie Whittaker episodes that the catch-up hasn't been quite as strong, partly because more people watched it when it went out, I suppose. So whereas the Capaldi episodes, which had a few of them had slightly lower overnights, but they tended to have bigger increases and sometimes ended up with a bigger rating overall. So again, if you think about it, are people more likely to go out on a Saturday night? Yeah. Yes, that's probably true. Does that mean that people who are watching it on a Saturday night, are they more dedicated or less dedicated than people who would just happen to be in on a Sunday? You can go through all of these things, and I think it does have a small impact, probably not a massive one. I should point out. You know, I'm not saying before anyone sort of says, oh, you know, Tom Spilsbury is just saying because it's on a Sunday that explains it all. Of course, it doesn't. It's a factor. But you know, I think people aren't always very open to the idea that there might be lots of different factors and lots of things going on. And one of those factors is probably, people have drifted away from the series because they weren't enjoying it as much anymore. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say that, some people haven't really enjoyed this era of Doctor Who, and so they've drifted away, or they're scoring it lower. That's, that is fine. We know that is going to be true in some cases. But I think, similarly, and I say to the other side of the argument, it doesn't also mean that everything is everything is a disaster because the viewing figures have dropped a bit. Clearly, that's not the case either. Nuance. I mean, I know it's a strange concept these days to have nuance about
and
anything.
Fandom anyway, for sure.
I know, but there we go.
One of the interesting things that I thought, if you look at television in general just now, or actually cinema as well, there's a lot of nostalgia happening now. I mean, certainly in the mid-teens there, particularly when Jodie was announced, you had lots and lots of gender-based, as people would call it, the woke thing happening. You had the Ghostbusters, Ocean 8, Doctor Who, Captain Marvel, all this stuff happened, where they did flip genders quite a bit. And nowadays it seems to be the nostalgia bombing. So you've got like Far From Home, you've got The Mandalorian and Boba Fett, and all this stuff, the Marvel stuff, where they're just chucking nostalgia at people. Now with Bad Wolf being owned by Sony, who obviously I think they do Ghostbusters, and certainly they do Spider-Man. Do you think Russell might bring on the nostalgia bombs to try and kind of, soothe some of the kind of louder noises in fandom that aren't particularly happy?
Well, I mean, I don't think, if he does, I don't think it will be particularly for that reason. I don't think Russell's particularly interested in sort of fandom wars and the culture war, I suppose. And I think, the culture war, for want of a better way of putting it, is something which is clearly going on. It's bigger than Doctor Who, isn't it? I can see, it's become very politicized. Again, people just sort of seem to have picked their sides on this, and of course, things are never that black and white and never that straightforward. The idea that you might cast a woman in a TV show, and that this is automatically seen to be sort of part of an agenda or being woke or all of that. Similarly, I do find, again, on the other side of it, I do find it a little wearing that sometimes these things. I wasn't a fan at all of they did that glass ceiling trailer, as though somehow the idea of casting a woman was some, is something that was sort of bigger than it was. Yes, I mean, Doctor Who has had strong women in it for decades. Yes, I think it's wonderful that they decided to cast a woman that time and try doing that. But I think people get a little bit suspicious of things which seem a little bit too pleased with themselves. I think that sometimes gets on people's nerves a bit, it feels like people call that sort of stuff virtue signaling, don't they? And I think I find it quite interesting, as I tend to sort of sit in the middle of a lot of these things. I mean, maybe I'm naturally sort of centrist in my ways of looking at the world, but you sort of see all of this stuff going on, and people very angry about stuff on either side. And I just think, I mean, come on, guys, it's a TV show. I think I don't find Chris Chibnall's version of Doctor Who, personally, I don't find it particularly woke. What do people mean by this when they say this? I mean, its original meaning of sort of being aware about sort of social injustice and all of that, you think, well, I mean, come on, whether you're right-leaning or left-leaning, there's clearly some element of Doctor Who which was about standing up for the little guy and fighting the baddies and all of that. That in itself feels like it's kind of leaning in that direction. So I think it's funny when it's not just about the fact you might cast some black people or cast a woman or cast or show gay people in a show. I think sometimes what people object to is a lack of subtlety.
Yes.
I think it's more that. I think sometimes people find we all know the Daleks were a Nazi metaphor. I think that's not especially subtle, is it? But I think perhaps we've bought into that for so long we've forgotten what it might have been like if we saw it for the first time.
Yeah,
maybe.
I spoke to Rhoda Monroe about that very thing, about casting a female in the role, and I was always, my instinct was against it, and it wasn't because it was a female, it was because of the dynamics in writing of Doctor Who, particularly modern Doctor Who, because what normally you do have in Doctor Who is you have a very dynamic female companion, whether it's Clara or Amy or Martha or Rose or Donna, they have to be quite strong, with a Doctor Who is sometimes quite weak and quite indecisive, or either the opposite, we may be quite arrogant, and then the woman is the person who can pull him round. But if you have a female doctor, it takes away that female role, and that's what happened to Yaz. And Rona had said she wouldn't write for Doctor Who while it had a female lead, because she wouldn't know how to.
My controversial opinion, which I'll put out there, is that I think that oddly, the last few years of Doctor Who have been the period of Doctor Who, certainly since when it came back in 2005, where it's really been lacking a really strong female role model. Now, as I say, this is just an opinion, and it's a TV show, for goodness sake. I'm allowed to have an opinion about a TV show. I don't think that the way the 13th Doctor is portrayed is particularly strong a lot of the time. I don't mean this to be critical of the performance, but just she seems a very passive character a lot of the time. Yaz is also quite a passive character. It's odd, this whole thing about her sort of being in love with the Doctor, because this doesn't seem to empower her in any way. If anything, she's very much in the closet with the whole thing. And then even having sort of spent years traveling with the Doctor, and then all of that time in flux, or years go by, don't they, in that story. She still sort of can't even sort of admit it to herself or vocalize it. It's a strange thing. I mean, I'm not quite sure what they're trying to say with that story. Personally, that it's people seem quite happy to have some representation of perhaps a same-sex relationship. But it's not really a relationship. It's more a sort of obsession she seems to have with the Doctor. And I don't. This is what I mean. When people say it's very woke, I don't think it is particular. I think a really positive portrayal of that, which should show Yaz kind of empowered by that, and she doesn't seem empowered. Now I'm getting off the point and wittering.
No, you make perfect sense, because I argued at that very point that Doctor Who, as a woke thing, it should always be aware of its social things that's happening around about it. But Chibnall tends to true signal more than do anything with it. So he'll say, look at this big concept, and then not do anything with it. And that's really frustrating.
And I think it's okay for people to discuss this and have an opinion about it. And we don't have to agree. I don't have to agree 100% with your opinion, Eddie, and you with mine, or with anyone else's.
Absolutely.
But people do get very aggressive about all of this and aspire motive. I think there's a lot of bad faith argument about a lot of this stuff, because that if you don't like this, it's because you're an underlying sexist, or if you, and again, on the other side as well, if you don't like this, it's because you're some virtue signaling woke lefty. Why do we have to sort of ascribe these kind of motives to people? I think I don't mind if you totally disagree with my opinion of this, of what I think about a fictional TV show. If people love it and they see something in it that I don't, and vice versa, things that people don't see something that I like, that's okay. But I think this stuff it's perfectly fine to discuss it. I find it a bit uncomfortable, this whole thing. People are clearly, this is, I don't really get involved with this, but it's sort of come onto my radar. People talk about the Not My Doctors and all of that. Why on earth? Why are people having these fandom wars about this? I mean, I'm sure some people genuinely are being sexist, and some people genuinely are being insufferable, holier than thou. But actually, I think for the most part, if people do it, if they're a fan of a TV show, they do basically enjoy it. They may find that particular parts of it aren't to their taste. And I think that's the hard thing. Doctor Who's been going so long now that actually if it was a brand new thing and you didn't like it, you just wouldn't watch it. But people are really invested in it now, and so they're never going to give it up. So even if they sort of feel they hate it, they're going to stick with it. But I do wonder to what extent people really hate it when they I think, there are always things. I mean, there are episodes of Doctor Who I don't have an awful lot of time for, but I'm always going to watch it. I'm always going to and there will always be things that actually, even if I don't consciously think about it, that I've enjoyed about it. Because generally speaking, it's a show I like.
I always said that one of the things that I mean, as you know, I'm not a particular fan of the Chibnall era, and one of the things I think that it failed at, which is a shame, because I don't think it's her fault, is that whenever there's a bad episode of Doctor Who in the past, whichever episode you want to say it is, the Doctor, the actor who played the Doctor, who, whether it was Peter Capaldi or Tom Baker or Patrick Troughton, was always amazing. They pulled it through. And sometimes Jodie doesn't, because of her passive nature. And because one episode she's like this, and the next episode she's like that. And when she hits her stride, when she does it right, like War of the Sontarans, for instance, Village of the Angels, she is really good, But sometimes
I think sometimes the trouble with talking about particular actors' performances is that does, by its very nature, seems a rather more personal criticism than it does if we talk about a writer. If you say, "Oh, I didn't like the writing in that story," by association, you are being critical of the writer, I suppose. And and don't get me wrong, the writers often come in for some savage criticism. But I think criticizing an actor for the way they, their performance, their body language, the way it does feel a very personal thing, doesn't it? And it's okay. Again, we should be able to say, I don't think that, I didn't like that. Again, they're making a product. We're the audience. We can be critical. I think people sometimes should be a bit, remember their manners, and this isn't a person you're criticizing. But I think it's okay to say I don't think. I'm not talking about anyone specific here, mind you, but say I don't think that was a good performance, or I think otherwise, if we only ever say talk about things in the amazing, well, that doesn't really mean anything, does it? But yeah, I think getting away from what my original point was there, but it feels as though I'm not sure I quite like this idea. This is a personal opinion I'm putting out there. People can disagree with this. I don't really necessarily quite like this idea that the Doctor can be anyone, which seems to be the idea that, or perhaps I'm wrong, but it feels as though you could cast anyone in the part, or you could, even sort of the timeless child idea, regardless of what it does to continuity. I'm not as bothered about that, but the idea that I think the Doctor could literally be anyone, and perhaps has been everyone. I mean, even I quite liked Jo Martin as the fugitive Doctor, although I'm not sure she necessarily behaves that much like the Doctor.
No, not at all.
Are there certain things where actually, if you bend it so much out of shape, is that really the same character anymore? I'm not sure.
She's got a police box that she shouldn't have, but apart from that, that's about the only thing.
True.
And a long coat.
But I mean, it's okay. I think it should be okay to say, even now we've had a female Doctor, I think it should be okay to say, I don't really think the Doctor works as well played by a woman. Now, I'm not saying that's my view. I'm not, but I think you're allowed to have that view.
Allowed, yes,
People
absolutely.
are allowed to say that without it being inherently sexist. People are allowed to say, I don't think James Bond should be played by a woman because I think James Bond is a male character. Now, you're also completely at liberty to disagree with that view and argue your point strongly. I think the strange thing is, of course, when this was a hypothetical, when it hadn't happened, people were less bothered about this. But of course, now it has happened. It feels like a personal comment on Jodie Whittaker and Jo Martin to an extent, I suppose, about them specifically. But but you know, not everyone's idea of what the Doctor is, or you know, should or shouldn't be, is the same. You know, we all have a slightly different view of what that character is, and I think it is okay to say, no, I think the Doctor is a male character. I think it's probably a less prevalent view than it once was, for obvious reasons. But again, if people sort of talk about, I mean, of course, you know, we may well see, but I know we've had Joe Martin in the series, but not as the sort of the lead star. You know, we may find we have a black Doctor at some point, or other ethnicities in the future. And people sort of retrospectively sort of say, you know, like they've cast however many it was, 12 white guys in a row. As though, well, yes, because actually it wasn't as though when they cast, certainly when they cast William Hartnell or Patrick Troughton or John Pertwee, that this just wasn't even on their radar at this point. You know, to seriously, it was probably considered enough of a risk to be changing the actor at all. Mm-hmm. You know, why on earth you would sort of, and actually they did change the Doctor quite considerably from Hartnell to Troughton. I mean, yep. You know, that the idea would, you would think the obvious thing to do would be to cast another character who is similar to the Hartnell Doctor, because that's all we had at that point. Mm-hmm. You know, but they deliberately decided to do something different. So in its way, Doctor Who has always pushed it a bit further and done something a bit different, hasn't it? Mm-hmm.
Well, Idris Elba said that very thing when he was asked about James Bond, and he says he would want to be cast as James Bond because they wanted Idris Elba as James Bond, not that they wanted the first black James Bond, and he was very adamant on that.
I agree, and I think often we get this thing where we can end up, again, often with the best intentions, but being a little bit patronising about this sort of thing, you know. But once again, that is where you get into the dangerous sort of box ticking, isn't it? Where I think I've seen people say, I think the next Doctor should definitely be a woman because otherwise it looks like, you know, Jodie was a token one or something. You think, no, but that's not how you cast anything. That's not how it works. They may well cast a woman. They may well do, but if they don't, it's not because it's a snub to Jodie. It's because they cast someone who they really want to have. You know, you cannot cast any. I mean, you know, this doesn't just apply to Doctor Who, but I mean, the whole idea of casting roles in television, you know, is that a script is written, generally speaking. And it will give some list of characteristics about what that role is, and then you find someone that can play that. You know, so most roles, I mean, the Doctor is more open-ended than some, but most roles will already be fairly defined about the sort of age you're looking for, the sex of the person you're looking for, sometimes the skin color, and again, because it might be really important to the story that this is about a black kid. You know, so therefore that informs the casting. You might find that it's not, but actually the lead character has a sister who has got to be the same skin color because they're related. Yeah. So then that informs that cast. So, you know, a lot of the time, you know, these things aren't just open books. You know, they're already often prescribed in a particular way. And if a showrunner of a particular show, and then let's bring it back to Doctor Who, if Stephen Moffat says, I'm going to cast Peter Capaldi because I want Peter Capaldi, he has every right to do this. This is not a democracy. This is not something which we all get to have we can, as critics, we can, as viewers, we can say what we think. But it's not something where, oh, well, it has to be this sort of person or that sort of person. The only person who ultimately makes a choice is the person in charge, you know, who has the final say. And then, you know, obviously, it's not literally one person. You'll have a team of producers and other people that will give their input. But it's but generally speaking, you know, this idea that you know, you have to cast in a certain way because of anything other than because that's what you want for the role is wrong. Yeah. You know, it can only ever be, I mean, I'm parroting Stephen Moffat here because, you know, this is the sort of thing he will say. It can only ever be because that is the person you want. For, and again, not Doctor Who specific, but anything, it's that person and we want them.
He was asked that, wasn't he, very specifically about why he hadn't cast a female Doctor, and he says because I was desperate to cast Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi, and that was his only reply to that. You know, and
exactly. I mean, you know, I think also we look at these things. Often you've got a sample of two there, and often we sort of talked about in small teams of people. The Doctor Who magazine team, which was a fairly small team, of course, when I was, and still is a fairly small team with them there. But it's like, well, I confess, within our small team of what, 4 people, I suppose, none of us were black, but that's a 0% proportion. But okay, but we, Emily was and is a lady. Not all of us were. I'm not even sort of going to start going into sort of people's sexuality and things like that, because also that's personal and private. But we can't all be everything. The reason we were doing those jobs was not because of any of those attributes. It was because we were the people who were employed to do the job. And when you're looking at a team of 3 or 4 people, it's completely unreasonable to be sort of suggesting that you should be a bit more female or a bit more this or that. And in the case of casting Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi, yeah, because he cast those 2, yes, that's what the decision was. It's. But I mean, we're going into these kind of controversial areas, aren't we, Eddie? But it's you can apply this. I think this isn't particularly a Doctor Who thing at all. This is a discussion which is going on in the real world quite a bit at the moment. And yeah, I mean, I think there are inequalities. Of course, there are. I mean, if you're looking across organisations, like you're looking at the BBC or looking at big companies or whatever. If you've got thousands of employees and for some reason only 4% of them are women, you might at least wonder why that is. Maybe there's a reason that isn't unfair or unjust, but you might find that strange. But it's also okay to say that different demographics often are more suited to different things or enjoy different things. I mean, the readership of Doctor Who magazine, I was often asked about the readership of Doctor Who magazine because it was disproportionately male. But I think, well, yeah, because a lot of the readership of Doctor Who magazine have been reading it for years. It had a disproportionately male fandom. I couldn't really change the readership. I mean, unless you're saying I should drive away a lot of these men, it's very difficult. It's far easier to lose readers than it is to get new ones for a start.
I think that's what happened with Chibnall's era, isn't it? I know I had a conversation with a certain brand manager or a former brand manager who says to me once, "Well, maybe it's just not for you." And I thought, I've been a fan of Doctor Who since 1970. How has it suddenly not become for me? And I felt that was quite disingenuous. And I've heard that quite a bit. That's been said. All these fans, and with the best will in the world, I've said before that guys of 30, 40, 50, maybe get a bit of disposable income. We put a bit of money into the merchandise and stuff. Younger female fans might not do so much, but they're very much entitled to be fans, of course. Yeah.
I think we all take it a bit personally as well, and I include myself in that as well, because it's when you have invested that amount of time and part of your sort of life into it, even if you don't realise you're sort of doing that, there is that sort of and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but that sort of entitlement of kind of, I'm at that, I've been here. I've been loyal when nobody else was, so don't make me not feel welcome now. I get that. It's a very human reaction. It's a very understandable reaction. And I think sometimes, when the boot's on the other foot, and we'll probably all have moments in our life where we feel like that.
I've read Lung Barrow. I've read Lung Barrow.
Yeah, we shouldn't. I think we should really try not to resent the people who are enjoying something when we're not. I think that's always a tricky thing. And again, it cuts the other way as well. People are often, you see this in political circles, don't you? The second that you criticise, perhaps the Labour Party, and you remember they go and join the Tories, it becomes that sort of, thing is they. Well, I'm only criticising an element of this, and I'm not going to go off and join the the other side completely. But I don't suddenly become the enemy just because we have a point of difference here. And I think, again, we see this in all sorts of societies, don't we? Where we certainly see this in fan groups, where if we seem to be putting forward a position which isn't as popular with another group, that it creates that division. But for goodness sake, again, I know this sounds patronizing in a way. It probably is a bit patronizing, but it is a TV show. There is room for us. We should try to get a little bit harder, thicker skinned about if someone doesn't like it. Well, I'm sorry you didn't like it. I did. It's
Exactly.
and actually, and let's try to.
I always go into an episode. I always go in going, please be good, please be good, please be good. Now, lately I've kind of come out and went, bugger. But 99% of the time in the past, there'll always be something to watch. And I've always said that to people, like, this era might not be for you, but the next era might be so far up your street, it's in your kitchen, and I know people who, I love Capaldi's era. I'm a big fan of Peter Capaldi for many different reasons, but I know people who really dislike it, and it's not just the people you would think, and then people really love the Whittaker era, and again, not the type of people you would think. And I look at them sometimes and go, I do not get why you like that. I don't.
The queer as folk, is there?
Well,
exactly. When it comes to sort of taste, again, broadly speaking, I think none of us want a world where we all like exactly the same things. I think that goes back. Of course, we understand that. We might have things that we metaphorically put into our room 101 and banish forever, but with the exception of things which genuinely are evil or whatever. When it's about TV or music or whatever, then we like to put it on a bit, don't we? We like to kind of say, oh, you like that? How can you possibly? What a terrible taste you got. I know people, I'm naming no names, people who I pretty much disagree on every aspect of things they like. I think they've got no taste at all. But I suppose the inverse would be that they would think that of me. I know I'm right. But
exactly.
But also, if I know I'm right, I don't need to convince you, do I?
Absolutely, of course not. So from just to kind of hypothetically, your instinct, I know Russell a wee bit, and he's coming back. What's your instinct for the 14th Doctor? Which type? Do you any idea where he'll go? Will he go male? Will he go female? What do you think instinctively he'll do?
Well, I think that's the will he go male, will he go female is the wrong question, because again, that implies that would be the first thing. I don't think he would think that. If he has an idea about somebody he wants to cast, then he will try and get that person, whoever they are. So I don't think he'd be going, oh, I'd really like so and so, but also I want, let's say. I know Hugh Grant has been one of those rumours that's gone round. He's not going to go, oh, I really, really want Hugh Grant, but oh no, but also he's not a woman, is he? And maybe he's too old. If that's not how he will think, or any producer would think. If that's what he wants, that's what he would do. So I think the only thing you can really be sure of is that he will go in 100% with what he thinks is the right decision. And I know that sounds a little bit like a cop-out answer.
No, not at all.
Because, also, I can't sort of second guess, precisely. You can sort of look at names that have been thrown out there, but they just as easily be names that none of us have even thought of yet.
I look at the top 10, top 8 or something, seem to be a lot of people who were in It's a Sin. And I wonder whether those guys are they're all deliberate smoke screens because of, I know he tends to cast from people he's worked with in the past. He's done that.
Well, this is things like bookmakers odds, though, isn't it? And that's where you tend to find, well, people inevitably will be drawn to those people because they're trying to work out the way someone might be thinking, aren't they? So, and of course we also know that he'd worked with Christopher Eccleston before Doctor Who, and he'd worked with David Tennant before Doctor Who. So it's not unreasonable to think that he might be thinking about someone he's worked with before.
Hugh Grant or David Tennant?
He has worked with Hugh Grant before. That's true. and I think a lot of those names, I mean, that are on those kind of popular lists are people that Russell has worked with. So I don't know. I mean, it's not unreasonable to think that, is it? That seems perfectly plausible. But
the latest name that I heard was Lenny James, which I thought was. Right. I mean, I know he's never worked with Lenny, I don't think, but it's it would. I think it would be extraordinary, and I think he's leaving Fear the Walking Dead quite soon as well. So
yeah,
I mean, I don't know if that's a spoiler, but I'm sure he is. But I think he would be superb. But that was just a name that I'd heard reasonably.
It's interesting as well, because we know there's the anniversary, and I think that's presume whatever form that takes, that might end up being a bit different, I suppose, to a series that follows, because just by its very nature, I suppose it's a different sort of thing. It's got to stand on its own terms a bit, I suppose. But
you wonder if he'll introduce a new Doctor who'll lead the 60th. It seems that maybe that's where the Tennant rumours coming from. It would make more sense to look retrospectively. But then
where do rumours come from? Because clearly some rumours are true and some rumours aren't. The rumours that are true might have come out because they are true. The rumours that aren't, where did they come from? Was it people trying to guess? Was it people misunderstanding something? It'll always be fascinating about rumours, because clearly sometimes people are just being mischievous and deliberately saying something, and then it gets passed on and nobody knows where it came from originally. And obviously we know, presumably, the ones that are true are because somebody did actually know something, but then maybe someone had a lucky guess there as well sometimes. So it's interesting. I think I suppose, I mean, sometimes rumors come out where it might not be what happens, but maybe something was considered at a certain point, and so you hear that. But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Doctor Who fandom will always be fascinated with rumors, whether they're about the next Doctor, or whether they're about missing episodes, or whether they're about. And I've been around long enough now to take a lot of these things with a healthy dose of skepticism.
There was a poor guy on Gallifrey Base years and years and years ago that had a really good spoiler hit rate. I mean, it was 1-for-1 all the way along, and I think it was kind of near. I think it was just as David had started playing the Doctor, or kind of maybe his second year, and he had said, I don't know if you remember this rumor, that Paul McGann was coming back, right, and he was going to fight Genghis Khan, and an elephant was going to sit on the TARDIS or something, and he was absolutely adamant. And that obviously didn't. None of this happened, and it killed the guy's reputation stone dead. But I mean, if you'd looked at it beforehand, it was 1-for-1. He'd got everything right, but then someone had obviously told him this piece of nonsense, and he'd went with it. And the poor guy would get. I mean, you know what Gallifrey Base can be like, and he got pilloried on it.
I mean, for one thing, I question necessarily when people are sort of passing on rumors what their motives are, because if their motive is genuinely, you might be interested in this. I mean, there are some rumors which you sort of think, well, don't spoil that for people, and there are other rumors where you think it's perhaps relative, but it's not harmless really, but it's even more harmless. But
sorry, Tom, that happened to us a year or so ago. We got wind of Sacha Dhawan being the master,
right?
And I contacted Jenny at Cardiff, and I said, "Is this true?" And she went, "Please don't tell anyone." And I said, "No, absolutely, we'll completely just sit on that." Do you know what I mean?
Sometimes these things can spoil things, not in the sense of spoil bit for viewers, but spoil it in the sense that maybe they haven't got a contract sorted out yet, that they want to do that, but they're still in negotiations or whatever. So sometimes there is harm that can be done with this stuff, and I think it might not matter to the guy on the internet, but or woman on the internet, might not be a guy, but it's
normally as a guy, in fairness,
it can have an impact, and obviously. There are things which clearly they don't want to be revealed at a certain point. So maybe it just makes you a bit of a Burke, I'll say mildly.
Spoil sport sometimes.
Well, I think if you're doing it to sort of try and get points for your hit rate, and
Yeah.
that does sound a little egotistical to me. It's kind of like, well, is that the reason for doing it, basically to become popular? That, I mean, okay, I mean, again, I suppose it's often how things work in the world, isn't it? But it's that seems a bit silly.
Well, I was very keen to keep. I remember the Yana kind of reveal in the end of Utopia, and being absolutely blown away with how good that was. And I thought, well, if someone else can have their Yana moment with Sacha Dhawan, then they absolutely should. They're entitled to that. And we sat on that. In fact, we done the opposite of that. We actually we kind of usurped it, and we kind of shut it off in places that we're going to reveal it, because
it's hard, isn't it? Because sometimes things get out there and then they sort of get a bit out of control, and sometimes maybe only a few people have heard about it, and you kind of, and also, I know I watched that episode with my dad. That was I was back in Bristol visiting my dad, and it was such a lovely thing seeing that unfold at the end of Utopia, and seeing I knew it was going to happen, of course, because I'd worked on the magazine, and obviously we probably already sent the issues off to press with John Sim and Derek Jacobi interviews and all of that. But to see his reaction was lovely, and isn't it lovely to see people genuinely being surprised and getting a reaction? And sometimes it doesn't happen very often with me, because the nature of my job in the past has been generally to have known what was coming up, I get that. I tended to get that with other TV shows where I didn't necessarily follow all the ins and outs of this stuff, and which is how most people watch Doctor Who, to be fair. I mean, it's only a fairly tiny proportion of people who are, so you can argue, look, well, if people could spoil every last second of it by discussing, I mean, they literally have had a whole episode leak in the past at certain points. But it would still be new to 100% of the audience, near enough, when it actually comes on. I can see why it's annoying for them if it's about lot stuff and all of that. But it's fans will be fans, people will be people, and that's, maybe we just need to accept it a bit.
That's true, definitely. So in summary of what we've been talking about tonight, just back to kind of ratings and things. Chibnall Era, has it been a success, a failure? What do you think? Has it gone down in popularity, or has it just kind of bubbled along and became maybe more kind of vanilla than most?
If you're talking purely in sort of in numbers, in that way, which is, because otherwise, how do you quantify success even in that? I think it's been moderately successful. Again, you have to put this in some kind of context, because if this was a brand new show that had started, and there was, you ignore the rest of Doctor Who before that, you'd be looking at that and going, well, it's getting the figures that His Dark Materials was getting. It's kind of fine, it's quite good. I think it's only because we've seen higher levels of success at times that this looks comparatively not as successful. It's been moderately successful, I would say. Critically, that's not for me to say on behalf of everyone else. We'll see what history makes of it. if that's the I think Matt Strevens makes a good point that there will be a certain reappraisal simply because it won't be the current thing anymore. That is true, I think, of anything. There's no, as I said right back at the start of our chat, Eddie, people will no longer get quite so aggressively angry about it, or even necessarily, even as excitedly, what's the opposite? You know what I mean?
I know what you mean, yeah.
Because we can never quite recreate that moment of Utopia again once we've seen it. And so actually, sometimes we watch an episode of Doctor Who, that was the best thing ever. And then actually familiarity means, it can't ever quite have that same reaction again. We can all watch Earthshock now when we know the Cybermen are going to turn up. Sorry if anybody hasn't watched that one yet.
Catch up.
And the other shock that happens in that episode, in that story. I think we can still say that's a bloody good story.
Yeah.
But in a sense, it's kind of its immediate power can never be quite as strong as it was than when we saw it the first time, and I love watching, again, slight tangent here, I love watching like reaction videos of people on YouTube who've never seen these stories before, just because I like seeing their reaction to they don't know that the Cybermen are going to be in it, or they don't know quite how it's going to go, and that's such a novelty, because I've known what happens in Earthshock for 40 years now. Just to see somebody who doesn't know is lovely. So yeah, I think the extreme reaction, in a sense, will all kind of dull a bit, and people will say, well, that wasn't really my favorite era. I'd like to think anyway that people, because they'll have something else to be angry about anyway. We did a thing in DWM years ago before the series came back, and we used to do this kind of spoof news page called the Space-Time Telegraph. I don't know if you remember it. And one of the little spoof stories on it was, new Doctor Who announced, fans excited about the idea of hating something new, because we'd had so long of not really having anything new. Suddenly, the novelty of that, and there is always. I mean, we were being silly, but there's some truth in that, isn't there?
When I spoke to Andrew Cartmel, he discussed after series 24, him and Sylvester kind of sat down and went, "Oh, that didn't really work, did it? Let's look at that again." And they kind of reinvented the Seventh Doctor, for remembrance. And I think that if you look at Colin, that's tend to happen through Big Finish more than anything else. And I don't feel that Jodie's had that courtesy yet, and I think it will come.
It's interesting, that, isn't it? I know you say that, because I think clearly with Andrew Cartmel's time, and I know there are people who really don't like that, and other people who love it, goes without saying, even though I just did say it. But I think you can see, what one would have to see, that there is clearly, they're getting to a point where they're doing what they wanted to be doing all along, kind of thing. They've seen what they feel works. They've kind of refined it and molded it into something, so that by the end of that, you've got a rather different Doctor in Survival to the one we had in Time and the Rana. It's quite an extreme change in a lot of ways, perhaps more than most Doctors, and not just in terms of the Doctor, but the whole feel of the show. And you're right. I mean, poor old Colin never really got much of a sort of development at all, really, because Trial of a Time Lord, being only his second series, really. I know Twin Dilemma was part of the thing, and then he had that. But really, it just feels like the whole thing is cut short before it got anywhere very much. And with Jodie, I think it's been unfortunate that this final series, Flux, probably was a bit shorter than it might have been. I think it's been I think people will be talking about Flux for a long time, because I think it's like. I think there are interesting parallels to something like Trial of a Time Lord, but it's so fascinating. We'll never stop being interesting to say, and what was that bit about? It'll be, it's kind of got everything thrown at it, and it's a very, very different series of Doctor Who to the first series she did. It's clearly a very different beast that it's become. So I think it will be one of those things that we'll never get bored of kind of dissecting and it's the one thing you have to sort of say about Doctor Who is that whether people love it or hate it never stops providing a lot of talking points and things that we will really want to say. What was the Grand Serpent doing? What was that about?
Where is he sat on that rock?
Why did he form UNIT only to disband it several decades later?
Yeah.
what was that for? I mean, I find it fascinating, and I think that much in the same way that Trial of a Time Lord will never stop being fascinating. It's kind of what is a megabyte modem? What was Valiard really trying to do? There is that element to it in a way that it's rather more interesting than I don't know, something like Tomb of the Cybermen or something. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of got so much more to unpick. Whether that's because it's better written or better, that's again for the individual to decide. But yeah.
I know that they were talking about the Trial of the Time Lord, and obviously the end of that has, you're right, it's parallels. The end of that had to be kind of hastily rewritten because obviously Bob Holmes sadly died.
Yeah, and so, of course, sometimes the off-screen story is as interesting as the on-screen story, isn't it? You know, that's what was going on. And of course, we know a lot about that. But I don't know how much we knew. Obviously, we knew Robert Holmes had died, I suppose. That would have been reported, but we didn't necessarily, you know as much as we would know now about all of the problems they had. And actually, I think again, it's been quite private in a way. This, if you know what I mean, this era of Doctor Who, because we haven't had confidential, and we haven't had quite as much in the way of behind the scenes material and so on. So I think in a way, we don't necessarily know quite as much about the reason why decisions were made, or how we got to the point that we got. So yeah, whether we will find out more in years to come.
It's very staged managed, isn't it? So that and I think that's maybe one of the other reasons that for some people Jodie that just didn't take to, because you know, David and Matt and Peter were very much out there with everybody, and she's not been as much, which is a shame, because I think she comes across personally better sometimes than a doctor does.
But I mean, you know, there's no obligation to do all this stuff. I mean, also we're kind of used to this with Doctor Who because that's sort of how it's been done in the past, as you say. But actually, most shows, we don't bother with all of this other stuff. We just watch it. We just watch Death in Paradise. I've never read an article about Death in Paradise about why they made the decisions they did. I mean, I write for a TV magazine now. I write for TV Choice and Social TV Guide, and you know, we'll do little previews of series, but nobody's really interested in talking about them much once they've been on. It's all about, you know, we're unusual as Doctor Who fans that we kind of want to come back to it and really dissect this stuff, you know.
I watch a YouTube channel called New Rock Stars, and they do this with the Marvel and the Star Wars stuff as well. So they after every episode or movie, they properly dissect it, and every Easter egg, every mention, every, you know, theory of what's going to happen next. And I mean, you know,
and of course there are other things that I'm a fan of, and I do like to know more about. I think sometimes, you know, we just have to be sort of patient that the passing of time helps with this stuff. Russell and Stephen were also both very present, weren't they? They were always doing they wrote a column every issue for the magazine. You know, Russell wrote his book, The Writer's Tale. We always sort of feel like we're very much we felt we knew them as people in a way that we don't so much with Chris, and that's perfectly valid because, you know, Chris hasn't wanted to do that as much, and I absolutely respect that and understand that. You know, I think it's an insane world to sort of put yourself into in a way. So I think maybe having that little bit of distance, you can't do it entirely because, you know, it just the nature of it. But I can see why perhaps he hasn't wanted to put himself quite so much in the firing line, if you like, you know. But anyway, it'll change again. You know, it certainly will, Russell.
That's what they say. What is it? Time will tell. She always does. I think so. Yeah. Phrase, isn't it? Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you tonight. We'll get this video up as soon as we possibly can. It's been great. It's been a long time coming, and I'm glad we managed to get it sorted.
Oh, pleasure. Happy to chat.
Good stuff. So we'll finish up just now then. You take care. Have a great rest of your night, whatever's left of it. I think Trigger Point is calling me to receive.
Oh, yes. Yes, that was going to go on to the ITV player.
It's very good. Okay, so take care. Thanks very much for coming on, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
Hopefully.
All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.